Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. We do educational videos, and this is, I believe, 200, number 200 Bible Decode. All of them from the New Testament so far, and we've been mostly exploring the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. It was written by the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty from 69 to 96 AD, and they did it as a psychological operation against the Jews, who they had just gotten done fighting a war against, and it can be seen most clearly if you keep in mind your New Testament, your Gospels, especially the book of Luke, and then compare it with the writing of Josephus in War of the Jews, which is a history of that war against the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. And that was written by the name of Josephus, and we know that Josephus was an agent of the Romans, a member of the Flavian dynastic family by adoption, and one of the court historians for the Romans, even though he was originally a Jewish military commander who surrendered to Vespasian, who was the first of the Flavian emperors, and he defected to the Romans at that point. And when you compare the two, it becomes clear, if you know what you're looking for, that whoever wrote Josephus also wrote the Gospels, because they are intended to be read together and are two works that are interlinear, interconnected. The amount of parallels are ridiculous. There are at least 250 just in the book of Luke, and some of them are of various different kind of families or themes of parallels or puzzles, enigmas, coincidences, and codes, and one example is that the 3-year ministry of Jesus is just a replica of the 3-year military campaign of Titus, as recounted in the War of the Jews. Every place in that campaign that Jesus goes, or that Titus goes, Titus is the second of the Flavian emperors, who was earlier a general. And so every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes. They go to these places in the same order, over 40 locations, or at least 40 places, 40 episodes. And at each episode they are they undertake parallel events, and they are separated by 40 years in the record. And so it's a long list. It's way beyond any type of coincidental mistake or anything, especially if you look at the overall, that the Romans had the motive, which was to mellow out the Jews. They had the means, and they were the only people who had the means, because the Romans at that time in the Roman Empire had monopoly on censorship, a monopoly on publishing, and a monopoly on distribution. So it would have been obscenely hard for anybody else to have written it, especially given that it was written in Greek, which was the language of the Romans, along with Latin, which was more of an elite language. And in Judea, Greek was quite rare. Most everybody was speaking Aramaic, and most everybody was not writing at all. The Romans also had the MO. They had created a number of other religions as psychological operations right there in the first century. And but then the facts even weigh in further when you look further into the book of Luke, and find over 250 parallels that this author Michael Menescot's in his book Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult that just came out last year. He graphed the 250 parallels on a chart, two-dimensional graph with the book of Luke on the vertical axis and the War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Upon plotting 250 points, you can see that he has made 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, which is the language of the Roman Caesars, the elite language of Rome, and they literally signed their name to the book of Luke, just so that you would not be able to deny that it's the truth. Now we've moved on to another book that presents the same kind of argument about how the Romans really could have been the only people who were responsible for this. But it looks at it from more the angle of Paul. You know, and the motive really is to mellow out the Jews. The Jews had been a major thorn in the side of the Romans for over 100 years, culminating in this war. It was a revolt that started in 66 AD in Jerusalem, and at least three self-proclaimed Jewish messiahs temporarily rose up and kicked out the Herod puppet kings of Jerusalem, sent them packing back to Rome, and that required Emperor Nero to send in General Vespasian, who eventually also became emperor, the first of the Flavians. So that was the cause of the war. The Romans knew that the Jews were waiting for this military Messiah. So instead, they wrote those Gospels about a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, and turning the other cheek to oppression, among many other things that he does in the Gospels that are either pro-Roman or deferential to the Romans. At no point in any of the Gospels does Jesus do anything that is anti-Roman. All of his anti-antics are directed against his own people, the Jews, outside the temple, overturning the tables of the money changers who are switching out the dirty Roman money for the kosher Jewish money, and so that you could, buy your animal sacrifice from the Jews who were there selling small animals, who Jesus also excoriated. So, almost as if he were written by the Romans. But the case with Paul is even more pronounced. Paul is even more pro-Roman and more anti-Jew than Jesus is. And so that kind of clue is what caused these two authors named Thies Vaskelen, who is a Dutch guy, and Rosemary Sheldon, who is a colonel in our U.S. military. I think she's at Virginia Military right now, or when this book came out, which is 18 years ago or something, 17, I think. And this book is called Operation Messiah. It caused these two authors to posit that Paul was an intelligence agent of the Romans. Okay, so they don't get with the whole over, Roman-wide psychological operation of the entire Gospels. Instead, they just point at this one character in that fiction called the Gospels, or really not in the Gospels, but in the epistles and Acts, where Paul is acting. They focus on his activity as being Roman in character. And so they're not quite making the connections that it's actually the entire book is pro-Roman in character. Instead, they focus on Paul. So it does, kind of affirm the argument of the Roman origins hypothesis proffered by people like Joseph Atwill and Abelard Reuchlin and Michael Menescotts and James Valiant and Cliff Carrington and Henry Davis and several others. Okay, now we're in the first chapter here, just a couple pages in. We're going to just start reading and kind of see where they go, and if it would have helped them to have understood Joseph Atwill's book, Caesar's Messiah, which had just come out before they wrote this, that might have helped their thesis, or we'll see, maybe it wouldn't have. Okay, what did Roman intelligence, what did the Roman intelligence establishment in Judea look like? And what groups did it identify as threats to the role in Palestine? The internal security needs of a governor like Pontius Pilate were clear. He needed to keep the peace, see that taxes were collected regularly, keep Roman property safe, and guard Roman interests. Like most Roman administrators, Pilate probably served as his own intelligence chief and then delegated tasks to his staff, whose job it was to be sure the governor knew what he needed to know. This was no easy job in Judea. Pilate needed sources and information gatherers of many kinds, and his sources were limited. Apart from his military staff, he could use the high priest and the Jewish administrators of Jerusalem and the temple police, who found it in their best interest to cooperate with the Roman authorities. On the lowest level were paid informers, the Jewish quislings, Any opportunists who could offer useful information were of interest to the Romans. How many people Pilate had at his disposal or who his agents were, we'll probably never know. What we do know is that 5 serious disturbances happened during his tenure, and all 5 were put down. Such efficiency depended upon good intelligence resources. Okay, this section is called the Troublemakers. What groups were identified as threats to Roman rule in Palestine? They were many and varied, and there is a great deal of disagreement among scholars as to the identity of their members and goals. There were many anti-Roman groups agitating in Judea in this period, but these bands were often too fluid and unorganized for there to be any history to trace. We know that factions did not always cooperate with each other. Our only source on them is Josephus. Now, Josephus is a source for about everything because he was really like the only written work of history other than the New Testament to come out in the 1st century. And so, you know, the kind of the backdoor theory of this Roman origins hypothesis that the New Testament is fiction, the corollary to it is that Josephus is also fiction. So that takes a blow to all of Western history, because all of ancient history uses Josephus as a source for one thing or another. And, you know, some of it is probably accurate, but the amount of things that are in the parallels between the book of Luke and the book of Josephus show you that many of the things that he says are strictly in order to fill a code or to create a parallel, create a typology, or something like that. So you can't really trust Josephus as a source, even though everybody does, because they're not familiar with the Roman origins hypothesis. Our only source on them is Josephus and his upper-class mentality and apologetic attitude toward the Romans make him a biased source on the interests and activities of the common people. Even modern scholars cannot agree among themselves on the exact nature of each group, although they admit that by the time of the Great Revolt in 66 AD, the animosity some of these groups showed for each other often surpassed their collective animosity for the Romans. The best we can do is outline the major categories under which such groups can be discussed. Now, he does dismiss Josephus as a source here, saying that he's biased, but that's one of Josephus's major arguments in his book Jewish War, is that the Jews had these different factions of zealous, these self-proclaimed messiahs. Each had a different faction, and they fought against each other even harder than they fought against the Romans. And that may not be true. He could be completely making that up. So now he's going to get into the different groups of Jews that did have different, that they're thinking that are, fighting against each other. And a lot of this also is the background evidence for this is coming from Josephus. He identifies the different groups of Jews that are involved, including a section on the Essenes. And I certainly have grave doubts that the Essenes ever existed, because the only people that ever talk about them are all Romans, especially Josephus, and I think Pliny the Elder, and Philo of Alexandria, who's not a Roman, but he was a Jew, but he was an elite Jew that, you know, was complied with Rome. His I think his nephew Tiberius Alexander was a very tight person with the Romans. So those are the only people that have ever mentioned the Essenes. Okay, but this group that we're talking about is the Sicarii. One group consisted of the descendants and followers of Judas the Galilean and Zadok, who were killed in the revolt of 6 AD. These men were called Sicarii by Josephus, because their favorite weapon was the Roman dagger, or sika. The leaders of this underground party were Menachem and Eleazar ben Yair, the grandson and nephew of Judas of Galilee. Josephus called their movement the Fourth Philosophy, because he placed this group after the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Their slogan, "No king but God," made it clear that they were religious Jews who believed that anyone who acknowledged Caesar as master was a traitor. Judas and his followers attacked the Romans and any Jews who supported or cooperated with Roman rule. Unable to engage in open warfare with either the Romans or the Jewish ruling class, these dagger men resorted to terrorism and assassination to get rid of their opponents. Their threefold program included kidnapping, assassination of key collaborators, and the plundering or destruction of the property of wealthy and powerful Jews. This kind of terrorism is the natural weapon of insurgents, and such techniques are especially well suited to the struggles of an occupied people, since the normal means of military action is closed to them. Terrorist bands depend on tight security and secrecy, and thus the Sicarii probably never numbered more than several hundred men. If their numbers had increased, the difficulty in maintaining operation security would also have increased. Their system must have been effective, because the Sicarii have left no trace for us. Or perhaps they just never existed in the first place. Their job was to destabilize the political situation in Jerusalem through terror, and they were good at it. They never provided any genuine popular leadership for a mass movement, but this is consistent with the general practice of terror being used by small conspiratorial groups lacking a power base among the people. Their terrorist activities were aimed at getting more allies from among the Jews rather than getting rid of the Romans directly. If they could provoke a violent, oppressive reaction from the Romans, they might gain more allies from the victims of the resulting government oppression. Certainly, they created a strained atmosphere in Jerusalem where death in a crowded public place was an immediate daily danger for the leading men of the Jewish ruling class. Okay, now, in contrast to the Sicarii are the Zealots. The word Zealots can be generally used to mean a group of very pious Jews who zealously kept the law. There is a second meaning, however, connected specifically to the Jewish War of 66 AD. Josephus uses the term zealot 51 times to describe an aristocratic party under the provisional government in Jerusalem following the first Jewish victory over the Romans. This was the party that stopped the sacrifices to Rome and began the revolution of 66 CE or AD. According to the more traditional interpretation, this religious group of pious Jews drew its support from the peasantry fleeing to Jerusalem as the Romans swept south from Galilee on their way to Judea. More recently, scholars have suggested other interpretations. It has been argued, for example, that the zealots rose from the common people and were separate from the priestly party. They see the zealots as social bandits, as defined by Eric Hobsbawm in his book Primitive Rebels. Hobsbawm was like a leftist British labor historian who, valorizes these people. So these bandits, like Robin Hood, robbed from the rich and had a political agenda to fight against a corrupt and oppressive regime. This kind of banditry is a rural phenomenon endemic to peasant societies. It is a consequence of economic stress and social dislocation. These bandits live by robbing the well-to-do, merchants, government officials, or landlords. They depend on the goodwill and protection of the local peasants and are well known to the officials who are trying to hunt them down. For this reason, they often retreat to rural hideaways. Some believe that Josephus's description of lestai, L-E-S-T-A-I, bandits, of the Roman period fit this basic pattern. Like the word terrorist today, bandit is a relative term. One man's bandit is another man's freedom fighter or hero. Those whom the Romans identified as bandits probably included genuine malefactors as well as a few real revolutionaries. Although there is still no modern agreement on who the zealots were, even Josephus knew that they were a totally different group from the Sicarii. They were involved at different times and in different places during the Jewish revolt. What there is agreement on is that the Romans had no use for either group. Well, this is pretty strange to me that he goes out of his way, Josephus, to separate the zealots and the Sicarii, but I have grave doubts that either one even existed, or maybe they both existed as the same group, or maybe it was just fluid and there was a continuum or something. But even Josephus knew that they were a totally different group from the Sicarii. Now this gets even magnified more because now they identify a third group that are called the bandits. So they're the Sicarii, and there are the zealots, and there are the bandits. He just used bandits to describe these people. So it's like two gradations of bandits, with also a group of terrorists. So those are the three groups that we're talking about. Two groups of bandits and a group of terrorists. Many Jewish brigands were anti-Roman because they hated tax collectors and landlords supported by Rome, but they were not ideologically motivated. Their goal was to make money, and they did not care much whether travelers and villagers whom they robbed were Jews or Romans. On the other hand, there is no reason why members of this group might not have become politicized or have merged with other groups. If banditry escalated in scope and focused more deliberately on a political goal, it could evolve into guerrilla warfare. The term bandit-like warfare, with which Josephus describes the messianic rebellions that broke out at the death of Herod in 4 BC, shows the similarity between bandits and guerrillas. Brigandage increased in the Roman countryside after Agrippa's death in 44 CE. And thus, this sort of activity formed the backdrop of Rome's occupation of Judea. Still another form of violence, sometimes overlooked by scholars trying to describe the various groups agitating against Rome, was caused by urban riots. Urban rebels were an important element in the life of Jerusalem. The mobs aroused when Gessius Florus, who I believe is a pseudonym for Arius Piso, who is probably the leading candidate for being the namesake of Josephus, writing under the name of Josephus. He was kind of a shadow character in the Flavian court, and he wrote a whole lot of stuff, according to both Abelard Reuchlin and Roman Piso, who identified him as being the main source of the New Testament, and his family, his children, in independent studies. So Gessius Florus, the Roman procurator of Judea, made a raid on the temple treasury in 66 CE, for example, considered the priests leading the revolt too moderate, and they acted instead as a rebel faction in their own right. Okay, I'm not quite getting what the point is there. Still another form of violence, sometimes overlooked by scholars trying to describe the various groups, was the urban rioters. Urban rebels were an important element in the life of Jerusalem. So this person, he's describing this Arius Piso person possibly as one of the other groups that we have to understand of the bandits. So not only are we looking at 3 groups of Jews, but now we're looking at a group of Romans who are also, this is obviously what I'm talking about. Is this incident is a false flag.